I am 100% in agreement with Nahaz. I also agree with Nessa that people will anyway. right?
One biggest error that I think Al made has nothing to do with the schedule.
Nahaz, stop talking.
Take a breather, refresh, and relax here on the Rivalry Cooldown, where we bring you esports from the experts. Now, as always, we have Nahaz back with us, regular on the show, and today we are joined by someone new, so a name many people might be familiar with, but less so the face. So I'd like to introduce Bryce. He is the founder of the first esports dedicated law firm and on the Forbes list 30 under 30. So quite strong accomplishments for you. Welcome to our show today.
Hey, how's it going? Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no, there has been so many times where Nahaz has gone, geez, I wish we had a lawyer to ask about that. Man, I wish we
said no one ever.
No, she's not lying. And I please, for those of you that like this show, share and support this particular episode, because I am hoping to convince Bryce to come on again. I think, I'm obviously the big economics guy, but there are so many questions in terms of the economic value of esports that are so deeply tied up into things like brand equity and intellectual property that really are legal issues intrinsically.
Yep.
And I think you're seeing, even in some of the news issues that we're going to talk about today, those issues are really going to come to the fore.
Yeah. Okay. So,
yeah, definitely agree.
Well, the first news issue, I think the big one that outside of Dota land that's being discussed is Overwatch League right now. So it started off with, was Puckett the first person to announce that he was out? He might have been the first one that I saw.
Yeah.
He was part of the early wave, and now we're up to at least 4, if not 5 different key Overwatch talent that have chosen to step away. And in lovely, wonderful news, the website's currently down, so none of us can read the article, but Monte Cristo has tweeted that the esports CEO of Blizzard is blaming this on the talent, whereas, another regular guest, Richard Lewis, is saying, hey, Overwatch League wanted to cut pay for talent this year.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to almost treat this as a developing story because, of course, you said, and I'm not sure, it may be Puckett that was the first one to be announced as out, but Monty is obviously been the impact departure in a lot of ways. There's a very good write-up of his perspective on it in the Washington Post. I think it's really hitting a lot of problems potentially with the direction. And, I want to put all this in the context of where Blizzard is as a company, because we've talked before about some of their financials and what kind of the market attitude toward Blizzard. And that's reversed dramatically since we talked about them end of 2018, early 2019. Their stock had gone from 80 down to 47. Well, they're back up to 60. They had a really strong year. Now they're still, take it with a grain of salt, because they were up a little over 20% last year. The S&P was up a little over 30%. But I mean, the perception of Blizzard in the business workplace is quite positive. They were on Motley Fool's 10 best buy lists for December 2019. They recently got upgraded a price target from about 64 to 70 at one of the big investment houses. So they are getting rewarded by the market for having shed a lot of assets, for getting leaner and meaner around the end of last year. And this is the things that we've talked about in a very negative light, them announcing record revenues while firing a bunch of people, reducing headcount by about 20%. The market's rewarded them for that. And so they're going to continue to go in that direction, but the timing is particularly problematic for Overwatch League, because remember that we're supposed to be transitioning for next year to the home and home model, which is going to involve a lot more travel, a lot more costs. It's going to put a lot more pressure on everybody involved.
Yeah, it's a really interesting time, right? The economic realities of gaming and looking at where the intersection between, general gaming companies and esports really come to the fore, right? So for Blizzard Activision, esports is still a relatively small part of its broader portfolio. When you look at their budget, esports is so small that it's actually not even part of their public financial disclosure. So we don't even have a great financial look at what's going on in the Overwatch League, for example, right? And probably will continue to not have that. That being said, if you tune into an earnings call, right, it is always something that Bobby spends a meaningful amount of time on. So there's, esports might be small in terms of the economic reality of Blizzard Activision, but it is large in terms of corporate culture, it is large in terms of, their public facing narrative and what they're really proud of and what they're talking about. So when you have the type of issues that are now coming to the fore surrounding the Overwatch League and some of the controversy around talent leaving, it is potentially problematic for something, and for them it's something they want to address, right? I should immediately caveat, right, that when we're talking about the talent departures specifically, I rep the majority of these people, right? I work with Puckett, I work with Monty, I work with Doa, right, so on and so forth. I work with similar, and so I will not talk specifically about their departures or get into the factual background arguments that are going on in social media right now. I just don't think it's my place. I'll let my clients do the talking for themselves on that front. But I do.
Yeah, I was gonna say they've been pretty vocal. They've given us some really interesting looks. My personal favorite was the discussion about how the talent wanted to focus on player storylines and really amp that up. And Nahaz had a great tweet about that, I believe, or maybe I think it was you and Red Eye were interacting about how the stats and the investment that we put into player storylines really pays off when you're hosting a desk and you're speaking to fans at home, and when you have something that are going to have these Homestead weekends, which are supposed to get locals invested in their team, when talent is theoretically going to Blizzard and saying, listen, we want to create more investment into these players, we want to build up these narratives, and there's creative differences. I can see that be a real issue with, when you want to sign on to travel and to do a lot more. And, this is a banner year for them. And if they're not looking to invest in developing player storylines, what's the point of these Homestead weekends?
Well, I think it's even bigger than the interaction effect that you're mentioning there. I think that point is kind of something I think everybody involved, at least in the esports venue, agrees on. And that's that, look, players are ultimately the commodity that we're selling to fans. And even though, Bryce and I may talk about this later, that I believe that organizations do have a very important role in shaping incentives, in promoting stability, and in developing brand equity, both in themselves and their players. Ultimately, the player brands are the biggest individual source of value. And, it's, the NBA, NFL, and MLB have all figured this out, that those are all superstar leagues. It's the LeBron Jameses, the Kawhi Leonards that ultimately sell the tickets, and esports is the same way. And if you're not promoting those brands, we can talk all we want about, certainly I've criticized Valve, some of their decisions plenty, but the one thing that they have done consistently in Dota is they've recognized that the players are the ultimate source of value. And I think the broadcast presentation, at least, has to be made with that in mind. Now, the other thing you mentioned about the home and homes is that they are, and again, they're doubling down on this. It was just released in the last couple of days that they partnered with one of the major producers, and they're producing a new line of apparel that's team specific. I mean, they are very much trying to borrow from the models associated with traditional sports. The weird thing to me, and I brought this up on a previous podcast, is that if anything, the traditional sports franchises are trying to get away from being overly dependent on ticket revenues, and going to the home and homes seems like maybe forcing a square peg into a round hole for where OWL is right now.
Sure. I mean, I think reasonable minds can disagree about when is the appropriate time to make that transition. I do think localization, not just for OWL, but in general, and OWL is really kind of carrying the torch on this front, but I think we're going to see more and more localization over time. Sure. Will bring a lot of value, right? When we're talking about why do people become sports fans and how do they select the team they're a fan of, it's actually, the answer is incredibly common on the sports side, and in esports, we're all over the place, right? So they've actually done surveys that test this, but it basically says exactly what you'd expect. How did you become a sports fan? One of two places. You got it from your parents, or you got it from your geography, right? Mm-hmm. And that's essentially how it works. And usually, by the way, if you're getting it from your parents and it's different than your geography, it's because your family's moved. So, you grow up a Celtics fan in LA, it's because your parents are from Boston, right? It's not rocket science to figure out where these lines are being drawn and where they're getting back to, right? In esports, that's different. And so I think what Overwatch League is trying to prove out that is that you can create that type of local affinity, that local tie. And for them, I doubt that it's about, hey, we think we can go to a model where we're really relying on ticket sales to generate revenue. And it's probably much more about, hey, when you create this kind of local affinity, you can create much stronger connectivity between fan and team. And there's a lot of value to be created there, which esports largely give up on right now. Now, there's many ways in which esports are ahead of the curve and are much better at engaging larger global audiences, right? Because that's the environment where we were born. But it's just worth noting there is some real value there that goes beyond purely short-term revenue generation.
Well, and that's,
absolutely. I think it's go ahead.
I was gonna say that's something I just really want to highlight. We rag on localization a lot, but Bryce has a point, and I've seen this really happen with my work with Dreamhack, because typically when Dreamhack goes to a city, their Overwatch team is a large, identifying presence of that city as far as what Dreamhack is concerned with working with. So I saw it in Dallas and in Atlanta that we worked with the local Overwatch team, and they have like in Atlanta, they have these viewing parties that, reach their 600 person capacity within 10 minutes, and there is a line stretched out everywhere. In Dallas, they had these huge, incredible cosplayers in this like 100+ cosplayer group that was all designed just to support an Overwatch team that wasn't even there yet because they've been playing on the West Coast for 2 years.
I mean, I guess there are two kind of, not even counterpoints, but observations that I have in relation to all this, and we might be getting far afield from OWL at this point, but I do think it's interesting. One is, where does the economic value of localization come from? And to me, the economic value of localization is not necessarily, it's not as much as you would think about the team playing half of their games in one physical location, as much as, especially in esports, right? As much as it is that team has a presence in that local community in different ways, and that team has activities for fans and activities for people in that community that aren't just limited to the games. And that's, before I'm going to be all in on localization in esports, that's what I need to see more of, because I don't think that there are a lot of esports organizations out there that are necessarily trying to do that. Now, I'm optimistic when I see organizations like Complexity that are investing in a lot of brick and mortar assets that I think have the potential to be attractions for people around their area. That's the type of thing that gets me excited about, hey, maybe we can start talking about localization having some value. The second issue being, even if you do buy, which I actually do think there is economic value in localization, the question is a home and home league structure the right way to capitalize on that value? And there I am somewhat more pessimistic. I think I do love league play, and I have been on the record as a defender and an exponent of league play in the past. But I do think for a lot of, especially similar shooter games, tournament format has been more successful. The COD has switched to that direction from a league structure. And I think when Nessa is talking about Dreamhack, I think you can have a local team and you can capitalize on that local presence when tournament organizers are holding events in that area without necessarily having a traditional dedicated home and home structure. You can kind of have your cake and eat it too. But again, this is a question. It's not so much do I believe in localization. It's, am I going to see these esports orgs and the tournament organizers check the right set of boxes that I think need to be checked to realize that value?
And that's one of the really interesting points, right? You were saying we're getting far afield from OWL. I think that's when the conversation is most interesting, right? Like we're in the bottom half of the first inning of building out the esports industry as a whole, and we use this umbrella term, right, to talk about esports, which is really valuable and it's useful for kind of framing things up. But the reality is, you have a whole bunch of individual sports within this umbrella term, right? And they're all going to do different things. So we're going to have this home and home model experiment going on in OWL. Meanwhile, you're going to have a localization model that's more tournament focused, kind of in keeping with the history of Call of Duty going on in the CDL. And you're going to have other things going on, right? So for example, you're going to have Complexity, which is really pushing the bounds of what does it mean to develop these local ties outside of a franchise system entirely, right? And for anyone who spent time at in the Dallas, Fort Worth, Arlington area for the Esports Awards this year, there was a lot of content that was created around the events, and you had like the mayor of Arlington there, right? You had a lot of different people from the business development offices of Arlington there that were talking about trying to turn Arlington and the Dallas-Fort Worth area more broadly into an esports hub. And that's not, that's partially to do with franchising, right? And it's about having the Dallas Fuel there, right? And Dallas Empire, so on and so forth. But it is, there are opportunities for localization that go beyond franchising and there's a version of franchising that doesn't involve this kind of home and home model. This is the fun thing, is that we're doing a lot of experimenting. Not everything is going to work, but it's not, if OWL fails, it's not going to be an indictment of franchising as a whole or of localization as a whole. All it's going to be, if OWL were to fail, is for this particular game at this particular time with this particular exact version of execution, it didn't work. Meanwhile, if it's successful, right, it doesn't mean that localization or franchising would work for every esport. Everything has a fundamentally different model, right? Obviously, I know a lot of the audience of this podcast is Dota or Dota fans. Like, Dota could not be further from OWL in structure, organization, prioritization, investment. Like, it is so different. Different models can work across different games too, right? If you look at the world of traditional sports, we have a very common model for US team franchised leagues that I think a lot of US sports fans think of as like the only model, without recognizing that actually within the United States, if you're looking at NASCAR or tennis or golf, it's very different. Or if you look abroad, right, and look about how like Australian rules football is organized, or how European soccer or football is organized, right? Like, there are totally different models around all of this, and it can all work. And that's when I think kind of the painting esports with this broad brush really breaks down, and there's a lot of value in diving into what an individual game is doing, what it's trying to optimize for, and whether or not it's accomplishing those goals.
There is a
well, and I think even beyond that, you made two really important points there. And number one is I think way too many people are acting as if Overwatch is this flagship product for all of esports, and if it goes down, that esports is a bubble because OWL may be in trouble. And I think that's a mistake. I think that that's a vast overstatement. Yeah, there are a lot of people that are going to have made some bad bets and lost a lot of money. Welcome to venture capital. Okay, that's not news. Anybody that studied investing in industries that are at the same phase as esports, the bottom, the first, as you put it, that is par for the course. And the second is, as kind of Nessa mentioned, to me, the most encouraging things that I can see right now is that there are complementarities at the local level between these different models, because I do think steady state for esports, you're going to have individual organizations with simultaneous investments in a lot of different titles that do operate according to economic models. And if you can, different economic models in the long run even, and if you can show me that there are realizable complementarities there in terms of individual organizations being able to invest across titles and make those different economic models work together, I think that is one of the most encouraging possibilities in terms of the long run value of esports.
There is a counterpoint here though. So I agree that Overwatch is not the end all be all, because we survived before it and we'll survive after it. However, I believe it was Sir Scoot who had sort of a tweet chain, and he said, I don't hate Overwatch, but I hate that if it fails, for those of us who are non-endemic, they will see it and they will say, this failed, I'm out. And it will delay growth. It will set us back. And I don't necessarily disagree with him, because we saw...
No, he's right, but...
Yeah, I think it was like a Coca-Cola sponsorship of League back in the day that failed to activate miserably, and Coca-Cola stepped back. They were expanding into a huge esports division. They were planning on investing a lot of money, and working with League of Legends did not go well, and so they backed out. That is a major partner. That is a lot of money. That is a lot of development that could be put into esports. So
and look, it's painful, but when you look at industries at this kind of a phase, and again, this is what, why do MBA programs make so much money? It's because we have umpteen million business cases that are written about shit like this. These kinds of investments, these flagship investments, they tend to be either, at least perception-wise, either trailblazing, ground-blazing successes or perceived as gigantic busts. And there's not much of a middle ground. And right now, it really, it looks like some bad decisions have been made with OWL, and that there's, at least in the short to medium term, there are going to be some problems there. I mean, again, to me, it is all about, Blizzard is being pushed by the market in general and their investors to get leaner and meaner, focus on reducing overhead, improving margin. And at the same time, that's what leads to these situations where talent get asked to take up to 30% pay cuts in years that their amount of travel is going to be quintupling. But again, I think it's a mistake to look at this as I think it is definitely justified to look at OWL right now and be very concerned. I think it is a mistake to look at that as a referendum on esports, even a referendum on the long-term viability of franchising as a model.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're both right at your core, actually, because I both agree that it would be a huge mistake for anyone to look at any short-term failure within esports, whether it's in individual, like, look, businesses fail all the time, even in things that were like obvious technological revolutions. Like, look at the tech bubble, or around the late 90s, right? Like, there were far more pets.coms than there were Microsoft.coms, right? Like, we just remember the winners, right? The huge winners. In fact, the entire venture model, by the way, just a quick aside, is based on this theory, right? Like, a venture fund fails if half of the investments do pretty well. Like, if half the investments within the fund turn into relatively sustainable, successful business, that sucks for them. They would much rather have 9 of the 10 best businesses they invest in completely and catastrophically fail and have one massive home run. That's how they get their multiples. Yep. That's how they justify raising their next fund. So that is very much par for the course in terms of expectation around this. So I am 100% in agreement with Nahaz that it would be a huge mistake for an investor to see any individual failure, whether it's a failure of a random startup business or a team or a league, and say that is a referendum on the esports industry as a whole, and we should back out. I also agree with Nessa that people will anyway. right? Because
I am not going to fight you on that, brother.
Yeah, because not all investors are smart, right? And even the smart ones are devoting some very small modicum of their collective brain power into the esports space. So they will look at their one esports bet that they have made as a litmus test for the industry as a whole, even if there were dozens of reasons why that particular bet that they made was bad. And I'm not taking a public position here on whether or not what is the current status of Overwatch League for the obvious conflict of interest that I represent, like more than 10 teams in the league and a bunch of the talent. And I don't think it's appropriate for me to comment publicly in a way that could affect my clients' businesses. With that said, though, I could talk about the macro dynamics here, and it is 100% the case that when we are at the really early stage where a lot of these investments are starting to mature to the point where some of them, and it depends on which one we're talking about, are expected to reach a level of maturity where they're going to at least be expected to be hitting revenue targets. Maybe it's even getting to a profitability or a net neutral stage, right? And some of these businesses are not going to get there, and some of these businesses are going to fail and be unable to raise more money on a moving forward basis. And it is 100% true that as a result of that, some of the people who get burned will take a break and either never come back or wait a long time to come back. Mm-hmm. They will talk to their friends, and some of those friends that were thinking about making an investment in some totally unrelated thing that was also falls under this massive esports umbrella term, right? But really, like, the fact they wanted to make this bet on this random tech company over here had nothing to do with the fact that this league or this team failed over there, right? It's still going to impact their decision making, and that's just the reality we have to get comfortable with. I don't worry about that, right? Like, the concept of a bubble is that you pop it and there is air underneath, right? Turns out, like, if this was propped up on nothing, the esports industry is not propped up on nothing. Anyone who thinks this is a cool, it means that the value is out of whack with the actual current state of things, right?
Bubble is a term that we use in finance. Yep. Obviously, I'm going to oversimplify here, but bubble is a term that we use in finance when most of the people that are pouring money in are doing so with the expectation of selling that investment to another sucker. Okay, that's not what's happening in esports. Right. And one of the biggest dangers and the hardest problems that you face in finance is distinguishing a bubble from a legitimate correction.
Yeah, market
correction.
I
do think esports is due a legitimate correction. If you look at the consumer spending numbers right now, if you look at the income projection demographics right now, this is looking like, and there are several very influential studies published fairly recently, this is looking like the first generation in the United States for a very long time that is going to be in a number of different welfare metrics worse off than their parents. This is a increasingly looking like a generation of consumers. The big target market in esport right now is increasingly looking like a generation of consumers that is going to watch a lot of hours, but their ratio of dollars spent to hours watched is going to be very low relative to what we've seen in the past. A lot of these multiples that people use, comparables that people use to value influencers and such, right? It's looking like these are going to be much, much lower in the long run for digital media than they were in the last generation for TV and traditional distribution channels. At the same time, there's also a lot of pressure on the distributors right now. The industry trend in the broader streaming media space right now is that more and more money is going to content creation, and those the distributors, including people like Netflix, are really getting squeezed. Okay, they're having to outlay a lot of cash to maintain market share, and they're having to pay more per unit content produced on average. So all of those things, if you extrapolate, if you take those big trends and look at how they're going to affect esports, yeah, I do think the next year or so esports is due a correction. But the term bubble, it's a loaded word, and I agree with Bryce. It's just, I think most of the people that want to come out and call esports a bubble, either they're fishing for clicks or they have an agenda. I do not see the evidence of that at all.
Or they don't understand what the term means, which in my experience is like really common, right? I mean, look, I had a tweet chain on this really recently where I had kind of gotten fed up with the number of people who talk, who speak about esports in a way that has more hype than substance, right? And that are missing some of the really core dynamics here, right? Anyone who does not think that esports are going to be around in 50 years and be much bigger, right? Economically, much bigger market size is just like they're just ignoring all the data.
The same people that said that Netflix was going to lose to cable.
Right, exactly, right? Like you're missing the writing on the wall here, right? Like it is very clear that like video games are already the second largest entertainment in the industry in the world. It's the fastest growing. It's going to be the biggest entertainment in the industry in the world. I don't know exactly when. It doesn't matter. It's going to happen, right? Yeah. Like the number of people, like pick an arbitrary age. Everyone 35 years old or younger grew up in a world where video games were ubiquitous, which means that, roughly 2/3 of the world population grew up without games. Does that mean that no one over the age of 35 can be converted to a gamer or an esports fan? Of course not. We have a great example on this phone call, right? But like, I'm assuming you're over. I'm assuming over 35, but like maybe 32. I don't know. Anyway, I digress. So the core point I'm making, right, is that like we have so much room for growth and development in this industry. It goes back to this kind of bottom half of the first inning thing. So, show a sold out stadium image. That's great. And it's awesome. And it can really resonate with someone who doesn't really believe this can be a thing when they see 50,000 screaming fans in a stadium. But make sure you give the caveat of how often we see that, and make sure they understand that, we're not packing a 50,000 person stadium or even a 10,000 person stadium for a bunch of regular season matches yet. Why? Well, because our audience size is still relatively small. If you actually, instead of talking about the 300+ million global esports fans, if you actually break it down by geography and go local, like how many Seahawks fans are there in Seattle versus, whatever,
how many Shock fans are there in San Francisco? I mean, it's we are there in terms of the growth rates. We're not going to be there in terms of the levels for some time yet, and that's fine. And it's not even obvious, as you were saying earlier, that the packed 50,000 person stadium should be the goal.
Sure, I agree with that completely. And to return to a point you were making earlier that I really wanted to address about a team figuring out how to operate within these different economic realities and different systems, that's one of the points when people are asking me about the team side specifically and, do these team investments make sense? And I'm not going to comment specifically on any micro investment, but if we're looking at long-term event horizon, one of the really interesting things about the business of an esports team is that it is diversified in a way that a sports team is not diversified. So if you are the New York Yankees and you have a globally recognized brand that is tied to a sport that is literally dying, right? Like youth play rates are going down, viewership, right, is stagnating or decreasing depending on which year and how exciting the World Series happens to be, right? Baseball is America's favorite pastime in name only, right? And I'm not saying baseball is going to actually die in full. It's not. Like there's always going to be some audience there that's passed down from generation to generation, but it is certainly shrinking in terms of macro market relevance while, if you look at their age, their average fan age rate is going up, whereas a sport like NBA is staying relatively consistent, right? The reason I make this point is because the Yankees are legally tied tied to baseball. They can't just like take this
Right.
global mega brand and port it over to basketball because basketball has more tailwinds, you know, from an economic and growth perspective. Esports, that's not the case, right? Esports, these teams have figured out a way to play across multiple different games, which means hitting different demographics. It means opting into different economic models. And the value of that diversification is it doesn't like, okay, so OWL goes away or League of Legends goes away or Dota goes away, which whether or not that is inevitable actually remains to be seen. Maybe we want to talk about that at some point. But if we even assume that's all the case, it doesn't mean that these businesses are fundamentally disadvantaged because these things don't like poof overnight, right? Like there is, you start to see it and then they start to decrease. And in that period of time, they get the opportunity to go into the next big game and the next big game and this other league and this other tournament opportunity, right? And so there is a resiliency and diversification of that business that is really interesting from an economic perspective. That would be, you know, the envy of many other traditional sports teams.
Yeah, and I think it's in the last couple of years we're seeing really for the first time a lot of these big organizations make the connection in terms of building their own brands. You're seeing sort of the games change, but the face is staying the same. You're seeing some of these players make successful transitions to talent, to management roles, to public figureheads. And I think there's a lot of value in that as well. You know, Ninja is going to be highly successful beyond the life cycle of Fortnite. Right.
Yes.
We all know that. Okay. And I see no reason that can't be the case in esports. When I look at OWL, okay, I do think, you know, if you're holding on to a big investment in OWL right now, you're probably not very happy about it. But I also look at the individual organizations that are a part of OWL, and a lot of them are trying to do things the right way. They're getting advice from people in the space. They're exploring different alternatives to build these brands locally. And I think that's important. And I think we've also talked about on this show how OWL, the one biggest error that I think OWL made has nothing to do with the scheduling. I think the one biggest error OWL made is they impeded exactly what you've been talking about. And that's the ability of these big brands like your C9s to establish an identity within that title, that's not competing for brand equity, that those two types of brand equity are highly complementary, that as I am hoping that other developers, that the next developer that tries to do this along the lines of Blizzard is going to take a look and is going to realize having C9, having 100 Thieves in your game, that's a big win for you.
Well, we already
that's
saw
a
that
big
happen.
Boost for your title.
So Call of Duty has Atlanta FaZe, and I think at least one other brand kept. Was it Optic? Sold
but
out?
they had to go exclusive though, right? So that's the requirement. And yeah, I agree. I mean, like, well, so my example of that is the LCS and the LEC and the various League of Legends franchise models where, look, I mean, I get why there it is potentially interesting to say we want exclusive brands and we want to have the same model that's used throughout US traditional sports and say if your brand is here, it can only be here. I do get the draw of that. You don't want them to take the brand equity they're building in your game and then go use that brand equity elsewhere. You want it to stay home where the value has been created. But I think there are a lot of ancillary benefits that come with allowing these brands to be non-exclusive. And I think this is something I do actually feel comfortable criticizing publicly. It's something I've talked about publicly before, and it's not a decision that I would have made. I think that it's one of those instances where folks who are getting too wedded to the traditional sports model instead of thinking critically about, we have an opportunity to do something a little differently here, and why is there potentially more value there, and then seeing that, because when you build a league like that and you make everyone start from scratch in terms of building brand equity, there is value associated with that, but you are missing some of the opportunity to have that cross promotion, to pull a fan of a different game over to your game, and to just start from a place where even if you're not pulling a fan from one game over to another game, it's still something that they have ancillary recognition of, right? Like someone could have never been a fan of Cloud9 before. If you are a gaming or an esports fan, you are aware of Cloud9, right? Like even if you've never rooted for them in some game, even if you've never been a fan of a game in which they fielded a team.
Well, my own rule is that you have to look at, obviously there's a lot going on in esports that is different from traditional sports, but my own rule is if you're doing something that runs counter to the direction that the traditional sports franchises are trying to run, you better have a justification. And it's exactly like we talked a couple shows ago about how, I see certainly these franchises, they're releasing apparel that's supposed to look like baseball jerseys for esports,
that
and I'm going,
no one wants to wear because they're uncomfortable and weird, and it makes you look old.
Are you crazy? Like Major League Baseball and the NBA have both, they've recognized in the past 10 or 15 years that our apparel and these retro looks, they're great, but that we need to have things that today's young people want to wear.
And Bryce with Ateyo probably is very aware of that.
Oh yes, would you like me to plug Ateyo? Is this my moment?
I just say the launch you did with the women of esports was incredible. I was talking to a streetwear brand recently that wants to get into esports, and I was like, listen, nobody caters to women except this one launch, and it went insane. So pay attention.
Well, I can take no credit for that. Rachel and Brian are amazing. If you're not familiar with Ateyo, ateyo.com, check it out.
Pretty cool.
We welcome all selling out. But yes, as Nahaz was saying, these traditional sports looks aren't what people want. It's streetwear and more natural branding. If you look at what Chaos is doing with their merch, it's sort of a similar direction.
And I track us onto merch. What I was using that as an example of something that, if you look at what the Dallas Cowboys and the New York Yankees and the other big organizations, they have paid a lot of attention in the last few years to try and expanding their sphere of influence, recognizing that each individual game is going to have its own life cycle and is going to have its ebbs and flows, and that they want to have a media presence outside the immediate league. And so the idea that you would make a league predicated on the fact that you're going to limit the scope of those individual brands over any horizon, it just seems to me to be you're paddling really hard upstream.
And a really good example to what Bryce was talking about, especially with Optic, since we brought them up for Call of Duty. So if anybody remembers PPD when he left EG and started playing for Optic, what we saw in Twitch chat was these online tournaments that would normally have, 1,000 viewers, late night NA, very low viewership for these online tournaments that were just smaller. You suddenly would see 5,000 to 10,000 viewers with an entire chat spamming green wall with a bunch of Call of Duty players who've never seen Dota before in their life.
And God bless it, man.
Hardcore Optic fans just everywhere in Dota for like the first few weeks.
Absolutely.
It was insane. And that's
absolutely.
And then
and those are the kinds of things, man. I think again, when Bryce mentioned baseball's demographics, that is like the crisis point right now. This particular sport, more so than any other, is looking at their viewer base and they're saying, how can we get our product out in front of new demographics? And it's a no-brainer. So anyway, I think we've reached consensus.
Yeah, I think we're good.
We all agree.
Yeah, Overwatch. So I know one of the other topics we want to discuss, which I think ties in really nicely here, is talking about actual team valuations. I think we agree they're a little overblown in Overwatch and Call of Duty.
I did not say that.
Yes, sorry, Nahaz, I agree. On the front.
I think the multiples are well beyond what you can justify over anything short to medium term. I think, when you're seeing, I think the CSGO multiples are a lot more reasonable when you're seeing, teams in the 15 to 20 range on the HLTV rankings get bought out for, somewhere in the neighborhood of 1 to 2 million. I think that's a little more reasonable in terms of a multiple analysis.
Still a lot, though. That still seems
it's still
high.
A lot, but
not only you're buying that team, you're probably paying 5-figure salaries a month to individual players.
Exactly. But you're also buying a spot at a CSGO major, which I think right now is very, very valuable. And that's the thing. You don't. That investment doesn't have to pay off over a very long horizon to make it at least not completely crazy, right? When you're talking about in the neighborhood of 20 and $30 million franchise price tags, that there's no way you're going to reach that anytime soon. You got to have And it's not the intermediate cash flows that are going to kill you there, right? It's that you have to, the clock starts, the opportunity cost starts right now.
Well, and
right?
actually this is, I think, maybe a better question is, so that $1 to $2 million price tag, and we're talking diversification, these larger companies that are investing, they may be willing to take a hit on esports because they can present a more diverse profile to investors, to sponsorships, to something like that. So I'm interested to hear your guys' thoughts on, do you think that larger companies, non-endemics, are picking up an esports brand to diversify their own portfolio, and they're not necessarily looking at them to make any money in the short term? This is kind of like if you're a media company, you're going to acquire different media properties so that you have the capabilities to maybe produce 10 years from now. So when you go to someone and say, I want to do this project, I want investment for this, they want to look at your portfolio and say, oh, are you capable of this or not? And I see esports as being, an essential almost asset in certain portfolios right now, whether it's, production or media rights or sports teams that are diversifying by buying into an esports brand.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is another example of a topic where it's really important to not paint with a broad brush, and I think a lot of people do, because the answer is, if we were to look at, let's say we pull up the list of like the 20 biggest Western esports teams, there is actually a different rationale for each individual investor as to why they're there, and that can include, by the way, different investors on an individual cap table. Like some person might be, buying a majority because they have X thesis on where this is all going, and some person might be taking a small stake purely because they think it's good to stay plugged in and be aware of what's going on, and it's going to provide them like beneficial value as it relates to future deal flow, for example. So it's not even like all the investors on a single organization are going to be completely aligned. But that being said, I think we can come up with a few different buckets, right? Like, you do have some people, Nessa, that were exactly what you were just talking about, that are someone who's just checking a box. Like, they say, hey, we need to make sure we've got like our esports bet, so let's keep that over there, and we'll have that, and we'll be good. You have some people where it's more akin to what a traditional sports investment is, which is it's a vanity play. Like, people wonder where's the value, the valuation for the worst NBA team being worth $1 billion, right? How does that possibly exist? It's a really easy answer, by the way. There are far fewer NBA teams than there are billionaires in the world who want NBA teams, right? It is purely supply and demand. It is really
limited supply.
Yes, it has nothing to do with the underlying economics of the team. And by the way, like, the underlying economics for most of these teams are like pretty bad on a year-over-year basis, but pretty good on a long-term basis from the standpoint of, like, hey, at some point someone bought an NBA team for $100 million and everyone said that person is crazy, and now the worst NBA team is worth $1 billion, right? So there is some element of like, it is cool to own a sports team. I like winning. I like cool things. I have a lot of money. Why don't I get into this? Then you have other people who have some investment related thesis, and these people can be broken down into people who think that there is a really good investment around the team business itself, right? Either because they think that it's an asset appreciation play akin to traditional sports, or because they think there is some economic model around the team that they can make sense in the short, medium, or long term. Separately, you have a number of other people who think that they can use the esports team as an anchor asset and build other businesses around it, right? There are people who have hybrid approaches where it's like, I'm not entirely sure what this is. It's a little vanity. It's a little, I think I can make some money here, and like, let's figure this all out. Right. So there's a lot of different explanations to like, why did I buy my esports team, and just on a case by case basis. And some of these people have like very good beats and I think are really rational in their approach, and others of them less so.
And that's any VC marketplace you describe is gonna essentially fit that description. I think here's to answer the question that Nessa asked. Okay. I like to put myself in the shoes of let's suppose I'm hired by company X and they ask me that very question. And I mean, the key to the whole thing in my mind is, you look at traditional sports franchises right now, and they've recognized that they're media companies. Okay. They are media companies. The meat of their business is they got a brand, and that brand is composed of individual assets, mostly the players that have value, and they get to sell that brand. Your name goes here. And that's as valuable in the stadium as it is on the television broadcast, as it is on the jerseys that walk down the street every day. Great. Okay. That's where a lot of the value is coming from. If you are looking at a traditional media company and you're saying, should you be investing in esports, in an esports team right now? I'm probably saying, whoa. Let's take a very close look at why acquiring this brand asset would synergize with what's already in your portfolio. I don't think a purely diversification argument is going to justify that as an investment. What I think more people, quote unquote, looking to get into esports should be looking at is not buying a team, but is working with an established org in the space and, putting your name on Complexity's GameStop Performance Center or something like that. I mean, I think that's where the value lies. I think these individual brands that are already in the space, if you want to make a big investment and come in and acquire multiple teams across different titles, I definitely think that there's scope for that. But I in terms of, get your feet wet, buy a Dota team.
Well,
yeah, please do. I'll love you if you do. But it as a purely investment, as a pure investment vehicle, I think I could probably find you something better.
You have to admit that for Dota, it's probably better to get involved with a team than it is to sponsor a tournament.
Well, yeah.
It depends. Is an underlying requirement that the people who work for you get paid, or is that not an underlying requirement?
Wow, Bryce just
twists
the knife.
That's
just
a
right
lot
in there.
Shots. Several times. So what we've learned about Bryce is even though he and Nahaz have never met, he's been harboring resentment for years.
No.
He needs to get it all out. And several times he does not trust people. That's been his response every time. It's like, yeah, people are dumb. I like it.
It's a good way to go through life.
Again, it's the difference between the lawyer and the economist, right? I mean, our baseline is always, we know people are dumb, but our baseline is always people are rational. The lawyer can't afford to have that as a baseline.
I definitely do not start. I mean, I get why that works as a theory and why economics completely falls apart if you do not have that as your starting point. I have also lived in the real world long enough to know if you make that assumption, you will be disappointed many, many times over.
Okay, so back to why a team versus a tournament is a little more value. Something we sort of discussed with Bryce about what he wanted to talk about before he came on the show was talking about why Dota is such a different ecosystem compared to every other esport out there. So you've heard us talk about it on the cooldown that we cannot monetize or protect the broadcast in any way, shape, or form. And that might be the core
There's the two
issue.
factors, right? Yeah. The one factor being that this is a game where the vast majority, as a percentage of player compensation, prize pool is a much larger share in Dota than in any of the other major esports. And furthermore, as a percentage of that, you have one event a year that is the vast majority. And so much, as we talk about so frequently in this podcast, so much flows from that. And from the tournament organizer, again, I feel like this is where Dota is so out of whack with the realities of both the rest of esports and the media industry as a whole, that everything is pointing to monetization of broadcast rights is the economic model. And I mean, it from what you've seen in the growth of streaming services to what you're seeing Mixer and Twitch and YouTube competing for now in signing influencers. I mean, ultimately, monetization of broadcast models, of broadcast rights, is going to be the driving factor in the economics of all these spaces. And Valve has pretty much said, no, anybody that wants to can broadcast your Dota games through Dota TV. And that's just, it makes it a non-starter.
And the policy is different between Counter-Strike and Dota, which I am still waiting for an explanation on.
They're two different. The explanation is that they're two different companies. The Dota team and the Counter-Strike team at Valve, there is very little, if any, overlap at a given point in time. Most of the time, they don't talk to each other. They work completely differently. I mean, everyone I have talked to about this issue and my own experience all lines up with it. It's just Valve might as well be two different companies when it comes to Dota versus Counter-Strike decision making.
Sure.
And I would say even the in-game system is very different. Like in Dota, you can watch anything that you want. Whereas in CSGO, isn't it just the majors that they have streaming on Go
Yeah,
TV or
and
whatever they
if
call it?
if you want stats for CSGO, you got to negotiate with HLTV.
For Dota, Gabe shows up. For Counter-Strike.
Yeah, that's a big, interestingly enough, that's like a big sticking point.
It is.
We're like, we're like, okay, does it really matter to most Dota people that Gabe shows up in the first 5 minutes of TI? I mean, it's cool.
Hey, the crop top is highly valued.
It's a good
all
look.
right?
It's a good look. I mean, the reality is you don't value it until you're on the other side, and
That's
then
true.
it's not
That's
happening. And then, by the way, it's all the implications that come with it, right? It's like
True.
the level to which Dota is cared about, the product is prioritized, so on and so forth. And, you know, in comparison to Counter-Strike, where they're like occasionally throwing us like a mediocre to bad patch, and like we're just happy if nothing gets screwed up, right? So
Right.
look, I mean, it's very interesting, right? Because you have a company, Valve, which is outrageously successful from a financial perspective,
Sure.
right? And has created, or at least owns, the rights to two incredibly popular games in esports. And even within Valve, they operate these two esports in somewhat distinct ways. Though if you were to compare, like if we were to put on a board, right, and come up with 10 variables that we're evaluating on the esport, is it franchise or not, how hands-on is the publisher or not, so on and so forth, right? Like Counter-Strike and Dota are far more similar to each other than many other esports,
Sure.
right?
Sure.
And then you can compare that overall philosophy of Valve and approach to their esports like Dota, for example, to other games, and they're extremely different for the two core reasons you mentioned. And those two things seem minor on some level if you're not like directly plugged into the business part of the ecosystem. But I can tell you, like, those two variables have such a profound impact on every decision making that goes in. Like, so my law firm reps probably, like, if you were to list the biggest 20 Western esports teams, we rep between like 16 and 18 of them based on who you happen to put at the end of the list. And it is very interesting to note that among all tier 1 esports, we probably do the least work in Dota. I mean, like, you know, obviously you do have some big orgs there, you know, or that have been there historically, whether it's Liquid or EG or, you know, Cloud9 or Fnatic or so on and so forth. But like, many of these teams, like Cloud9, for example, have kind of been in and out. Some of these teams, like Liquid, have been there consistently, but overall, there are a lot of major orgs that have either never been in Dota or spent a very limited amount of time in Dota and then moved away. And it's because the infrastructure that's been created is not very incentivizing for them to like,
it's not org friendly at all.
Well, and a fun one about Liquid is we think of them as a Dota mainstay right now because of Kuroki's team being successful for a while. But if you remember Liquid before that, it was this like barely there NA roster that they would just kind of pick up now and then. Or if you look at an organization like Mouse, where they would buy a team that had qualified to TI every year, that's what you used to see
which
in
for
Dota.
whatever reason we looked down on in Dota, and is becoming more and more the norm, by the way. I never thought there was anything wrong with that.
It just that used to be the norm, is that you would be like, oh, this team qualified for TI, we'll buy them for 3 months, is what happened. Look,
Bryce's point, I think, is related to something that we've talked about Valve on previous iterations of this show, and that's that, you know, unlike when you look at Riot, obviously they are trying to diversify a portfolio of titles, but for all intents and purposes, historically, Riot is League and League is Riot. Blizzard has elevated Overwatch as a title to sort of one of its flagship products that it's selling to investors, as we talked about earlier on this show. Valve has not and never will be Dota or CSGO. Valve is Steam. As a fraction of Valve's total revenues, both Dota and CSGO they're not necessarily revenue leaders. Valve is, first of all, a private company, and second, in a given year, those margins are under a lot more pressure now than they were 10 years ago, but it's still the case that in a given year they're making more money from Steam than they are from either of those individual titles. So there's the organizational structure is a lot less formal. There are a lot more decisions that get made by, you know, the 5 people that happen to gather in this room for lunch at a particular time in Dota and CSGO than there are in a lot of these other titles. And a lot of it is just understanding the company dynamics.
And I always point out, people would complain about how all of this money had been spent on the battle pass, and it was like, you know, Valve, we have a $20 million prize pool, which means that we spent, you know, 80 million is it 25%? Yeah.
Yeah, 25%.
Yeah.
25%.
So yeah, it means we've spent 80 million. Geez, you're pocketing 60 million. How dare you not give us more? And I sit there and I go, hey, so you know what Valve did when they sold PUBG on Steam?
Yeah.
They sold what, like 100 million copies in a short amount of time span. That's 300 million that they take 30% of, and all they did was list it and give it server space.
Right.
Well, if they even do that, I think no, they don't even give it server space. Like that's all they did. And you want to compare that to months of work to create a battle pass, handle all of those bugs, do all of the QAing, and then pay for all of TI on top of that? Like, people, their understanding of where Valve is getting their money from, it just makes me want to be like, look, you should be happy that they still care about esports right now, because it is not the cash cow you think it is. And I think that does not
Yeah,
register.
it's definitely not. I mean, you know, so it's a general problem for publishers, even for a publisher that cares as much about esports as Riot. And I think they're kind of the pinnacle of this, right? In terms of
I would agree, for what it's worth.
A long-term vision, deeply invested, right? It's still esports are still a fraction of like
Yes.
the core point of the company, which is to monetize the game League of Legends and what will soon be mini games, right? Which we can talk about, because it's gonna be a very interesting disruption, right? With Valve, it's even one more step attenuated, right? It's like the sales of the game or content in the game for Dota and CSGO is relatively small in proportion to Steam itself, and esports is some small sub fraction of the games themselves. So, you know, to my knowledge, there is still no full-time esports staff member at Valve, right? You know, I know that
all there is Casey. Casey
Casey is the closest thing.
Developer there, and that's
no. I mean,
it.
Valve in the last couple of years has hired. They have hired people in more targeted roles. They have hired people more surrounding TI, and this is even before Casey. This was going on, so there are some signs that, you know, Valve may be moving a little more in that direction. That has, it's significant because historically they've resisted it. But no, I think that's we probably don't have time for it today. I think that I think what you're going to see happening with Riot in the next 12 to 18 months is an absolutely fascinating natural experiment. Yes. I think that's going to be, if you want to learn something about what's going to work and what's not, and where the esports industry is headed, pay very close attention to what happens with Riot, because I think you're going to see a lot of do's and a lot of don'ts.
Can we remember what games it is, just to remind people? There's a fighting game. There's a card game.
Correct. There's a shooter, which
is
they've described it as a tactical shooter, which is code for we're competing with CSGO, not Call of Duty.
CSGO and Rainbow Six.
And then there's like an anime or a webtoon or a TV show. Isn't there like some actual media,
there's a web series.
A lore? Okay.
A media property. Yeah, I think they're not an MMO, but there's another one they just
I think I already said fighting game.
The media property is something I'm very interested in, because I think they put a lot of resources into that. What's up?
It was a fantasy product. Those are the 5 things. I knew there were 5. So it was the cartoon, fantasy, shooter, fighting game, card game.
I believe it's the media products, the cartoon / fantasy products are going to be related to extant League of Legends assets. Do we know this?
I don't. I mean, I did know this at one point, but I don't know it off the top of my head.
Okay.
It was one of the fascinating parts about that experiment, right? Is like as we're seeing the announcements around these things shift, where it used to be if you wanted to announce big games, you basically did it at E3 or GDC, and that was it, right? And then you saw a shift last year around the launch of Apex, which was absolutely fascinating, right? That it dropped out of nowhere, and their strategy was, we're just going to pay the top 20 influencers, and we're going to flood Twitch and YouTube with content for this. And it really worked. In fact, I think there's a lot of reasonable minds that think that if EA had been more prepared for the incredible overnight success of Apex, it might still be really prominent to this day. They weren't ready. The content wasn't ready. The product itself just wasn't ready to handle that massive amount of attention.
I'm for the record, I'm not even totally convinced Apex is gone. I actually think, I think totally there still might be value there.
It could pull a CSGO, right? I mean, if you look at what CSGO was like upon release as compared to now.
Look at Rainbow Six Siege.
Yeah,
totally. Rainbow Six Siege, for the first part of its life cycle, was a miserable failure. But Ubisoft the advantage is Ubisoft is a very well capitalized country. They're very company. They're very committed to their titles, and that team was given a hell of a lot of resources to go back and say, look, we believe in this as a product. Go create something special. And that's again, EA. It's significant to me, right? EA, can afford to have something that doesn't work for a while and keep pouring capital into it. I mean, that's something that I don't think that a lot of people that talk about esports investments and things around the esports space, they maybe aren't as experienced talking about investments in other spheres, because you always talk about capitalization, right?
Yep.
That's one of the number one predictors of success, and I think that's partly why, because Riot is not necessarily as well capitalized, although some of the money coming in from other parts of the world, maybe they are now.
I mean, I think they're in pretty good shape.
Yeah, they probably are. So
I'm definitely not worried about their coffers.
I mean, they can just add a few microtransactions. Everybody will love that.
Okay, all right. We're not going to be Star Wars Battlefront 2.
They're going to create the Nahaz economist skin, and it's going to sell.
Yeah, it's going to go crazy.
Wow.
But yeah, I'm not.
Is there a style where I have a pocket protector too?
I love it. There has to be. It'll have your back animation will have your bookcase behind it. It'll be really good. Now, this is free advice, right?
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, we saw Ninja has his own skin in Fortnite now.
Yeah.
Clearly, it's time for Nahaz to have his own skin.
I agree. And if it were in League of Legends instead of Dota, that would be the ultimate upset, right?
So funny.
Anyway, so I digress. But the point I was making around Apex. The point I was making around Apex wasn't that I think of it as a failure. I think that it was actually a really huge success.
Yes,
I think that it wasn't. If they had been more ready for the incredible level of success it had, I think it might have maintained its prominence, maybe even to this day. There's plenty of room for them to bounce back. I think the core gameplay mechanic is really compelling. I think there's a lot of potential there, right? But then you look at, I was just using an example of the new model of announcing games, because then you look at what happened with Riot, where they used their 10-year anniversary of League of Legends as this opportunity to have this crazy, I mean, it was surreal. Like, I was watching it live, I'm texting, live tweeting, whatever, with all of my friends.
Carnival atmosphere.
It was nuts. It was like, what? How can you possibly announce all this in an hour? And so we're going to have similar experiences around as these games actually start to come out. How good are they? How esports ready are they? And they will try multiple different things. Like, as you've seen with TFT, right, which is, I think, it is technically part of the League of Legends client. I think of it as a standalone game, really, in many ways, and it is their first other standalone game. It's not League of Legends. They've had enormous success with it so far. It's unclear how well prepared it's going to be as an esport versus an entertainment product, right? What kind of longevity is the genre or the game going to have, right? We will find out. But the fun thing about Riot is, because it's a company that prioritizes esports, we know that they're constantly thinking about it. We know there are people there who are working on the esports side of all of these different games, and so we're going to get to see them take a lot of shots. And no, not all those shots are going to be successful, right? Like, it's be very unrealistic for us to say like all of these things are going to win out in their genre.
Go back to the beginning in our conversation about the VC model. I mean, 9 out of 10 of these things are going to fail, but you only need the one to be a real home run. And I think this is only going to get more common, that you're going to see the birth of these mini genres as titles. You look at a title like right now, Escape from Tarkov, and all the play that's getting, and all the interest that's getting among the big influencers. And I'm looking at that and going, gee, how long is it going to be until you see the next big company either buy them up or make their own clone? Because that game involves distinctly articulatable elements that I think are replicable.
I agree.
Or it could be the Untitled
the model
game. That has possibilities too. There's options there.
Dream big.
All right, I'm intentionally killing the conversation with that comment though. That was intentional, because I know we are approaching the end of our time here, and before we went live, we had this great realization that in the background behind Nahaz, he's got all of his professor books. But if you look over just a little bit, there's a whole shelf of fantasy books back there.
I am a fantasy buff, I confess.
And it seemed like that would be a little fun for us to go into after all of our heavy economics and law and everything else. What do you got back there, buddy? What's going on?
So I will answer I'll do the economist thing, and I'll answer a slightly different question.
I love it.
That's also the professor thing.
It's a lawyer thing too.
Yeah. Oh, there you go. Right. The two guys that I want everybody to read, that I don't think enough people read. There's one fellow by the name of Guy Gavriel Kay. He's a Canadian author. He is historical fantasy fiction, and his work is they are pretty much the only books that I've ever like out and out cried at the end of a book. Like this guy, start with Taigana and Lions of Aurasan. They're absolutely magnificent. And I have a soft spot for Joe Abercrombie. I think the first Law trilogy is awesome. I think he's got a follow-up trilogy that just came out. The first book just came out. It's awesome. Go read him. I mean, it's literally like, think about the Lord of the Rings dark fiction where Gandalf might not be a good guy. And it's so much fun.
Where Gandalf might.
Yeah.
How could you say such blasphemy?
Joe Abercrombie is dark.
But it's great. He's dark with a twisted sense of humor, and you just gotta love the guy. He's one of those guys that I could picture him writing, just going.
If you like the fantasy meets historical fiction, do you read the Timarea series?
Mm-hmm.
I really enjoyed that. So I don't typically enjoy the fantasy meets historical fiction, but I thought that was like very well done. For those of you who haven't read it yet, it's dragon books set over the Napoleonic Wars, basically. Mm-hmm. So it's as if like Napoleon. Yeah, so it's basically as if Napoleon is trying to conquer the world, but
does he ride dragons?
Yes. So the answer is yes. They like all. So like everyone has dragons, and like in addition to like the talking about the British Navy, there's the British Air Force is essentially dragons.
How long ago was that stuff out? Do you remember?
It's a while.
Do you remember
it's
the
done,
movie,
and it's like nine. It's like 9 books, series? Right?
Like Nessa, do you remember the movie Reign of Fire? It's kind of like that. It's kind of like historical.
Yeah. That was okay.
Like, but with dragons, right?
Yeah, it's 9
dragons.
Yeah,
it's 9 novels, and it's done. He finished it in 2016.
See, done is nice because for all of us who got
really
sucked into King Killer Chronicles, which is
God.
not, people asking me, they're like, "Oh, should I read this?" I'm like, "Okay, well." Do you want to love and hate me, or just be mildly annoyed with me?
No, come on. The answer, the answer is yes. I mean,
you gotta read it.
Name and Fear are both. They're both novels that are sufficiently strong on their own merits that you gotta read them.
Lightbringer just finished. I'm so excited about that. I'm rereading all. So I just finished book 1. I'm gonna reread the whole series to make sure that when I get to the end, I've like fully fresh on everything. The Stormlight Archives is unfinished, but is like that's my must read. I actually take that over the King Killer Chronicles. I really do.
I agree.
I love the Stormlight Archives.
There are way too many people out there that before Stormlight had not discovered Brandon Sanderson or knew him mostly for his finishing of The Wheel of Time, and his earlier stuff is awesome. Elantris is worth your time, absolutely. Warbreaker is worth your time. He writes a hell of a standalone novel. If you talk about, oh no, Stormlight's not finished, I don't want to get sucked in, he's got a number of standalone novels that are just absolutely excellent. He's just a great author.
Well, and hopefully he'll finish them, unlike Patrick Rothfuss, who regularly streams on Twitch instead of editing his stupid book.
I have to imagine, I've never tuned into a stream, but I have to imagine the entire Twitch chat has people just yelling at him to finish the third book, right?
You know what?
Is anyone interacting with the stream at all? Or is it just like, it's our live chance?
Because there's a TV series and there's a movie, and he's insisted on being heavily involved in them. So there's some questions about the TV show, but it is just, he is inundated with like, go finish your stupid book.
I'm like floored still though that like fantasy is becoming mainstream. I mean, when between the last decade, it was, so I was a kid and Iron Man was my favorite hero when I was growing
the dinosaurs?
Up. That was like the dorkiest thing ever. And now all of a sudden Marvel's movies come out and Iron Man is cool. And now like I read fantasy fiction and that made me a huge nerd. And now all of a sudden like Game of Thrones is the series to watch, and it's like
and Witcher
Amazon's getting Lord of the Rings and Wheel of Time, and
isn't the series, the King Killer series, is going to be done by HBO, and Lin-Manuel Miranda is doing the music, right? I mean, like,
is that right?
Isn't that
it's guaranteed success.
I think it's going to
sign me up
before the books. Like, I think it's like a preface.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, it's like a prequel.
Oh, wait. So it's not. It's actually not going to be the same story as the books.
I didn't know that.
It's either the movie or the TV show, and I think it's the TV show is a prequel to the books, and then the movie is going to like actually be the books or so. I don't know.
That's interesting because my understanding is that the books are actually prequels. There's going to be a 3-part prequel to the main series. So if they're doing if the TV series is a prequel to the prequel,
because he's taking over 10 years to finish a book. So if he's over like 40 at this point, we're never going to see the end. And I think
is that actually true? Is that when Fear came out? That cannot be true.
It's long.
10 years.
It's been so long.
Wait, Name of the Wind was 10 years ago, right? Or are you saying Fear was?
No. I think Fear is not been. I think it's been that long. I think it was like 5 years between the first two, and now we're up to like 10 years.
Yeah, it was 2000. Name of the Wind came out in 2007. You're right. Oh my God,
maybe we're on like
2000.
Okay, yeah. Why?
No, you're right. 2011 was Fear.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Holy. We're looking at 10 years. For
I
the
had
third
not
book.
realized.
So I will say this: I don't get nearly as angry about some of this stuff as as some of the true believers, purely because I came to fantasy lit later in life. Which, by the way, if anyone listening to this does not know what we're talking about at all, I am so jealous of you because you're gonna get the opportunity for like what I had basically for the last 3 or 4 years.
Yes.
You just get to go to the greatest hits. You get to read series that have been finished that people waited, like Lightbringer series, like great, like just go read it all.
The entire works of Terry Brooks, who wrote like 30 books.
Yes.
And it's a bunch of trilogies that span thousands of years in the same universe that is absolutely fascinating.
That you don't know at first that they're in the same universe, and you get to discover that. It's cool.
Oh, it's so cool. The whole Word series, the way that the Word series fits in, and the like reveal in that was just mind blowing. And then the reveal at the end of the Isle Witch. Or where
all right. No.
This is we're getting into kind of spoiling territory right now.
A lot of people have not read. A lot of people my age have not read Terry Brooks. It's a little too old for them. And I'm like, guys, Tolkien's like the grandfather, and then Terry Brooks is modern fantasy. Like, if you want to talk about that.
Terry Brooks's original 3 books are and particularly Elfstones and Wish Song of Shannara they're really great books. They're worth your time. They stand the test of time. I mean, Elfstones has been remade in a somewhat successful series even recently.
The acting could be better.
It wasn't perfect, but
we also haven't talked about sci-fi at all, which a quick shout out, they are adjacent genres and there's a lot of value in them. I always recommend Red Rising to people who have only read fantasy but not read much in the way of sci-fi, because I think it's a really good bridging of
Did you like Iron Gold as well as the first 3?
No.
Okay, I have been called a blasphemer by many friends of mine because I thought Iron Gold was a good book, but I didn't think it was as good as the first.
It's definitely not as good.
But Pierce Brown is the man, and those first 3 books they're just tremendous reads. And I don't care what genre you want to put them in. I don't care how old you are. Just go read them. They're tremendous.
Michael Crichton's another good crossover between fantasy and sci-fi.
You should just clip this part of the show and just like publish it separately. It's like a quick entree into fantasy and sci-fi lit. This is good value here. I mean, I get a lot of texts about this. I'm just gonna be like, go watch this, skip the first hour about all that esports economic garbage and get into the good stuff.
That's right. So we're always so hardcore into the numbers, which I know can be really hard for people to get into. And I like to present another side to the guests every once in a while and show them. But I know that we have about 3 minutes left of Bryce's time. I'm really upset that he did not make the meme happen for us, but it's okay.
Nahaz, stop talking.
Thank you.
There you go.
I got you.
There's the social media clip I was looking for.
A little forced, but here we are.
No, that's what I need. I need to go viral on Reddit. I need everyone to come and watch the whole thing just to get to the book discussion. They'll do it off that clip alone. Anyway, thank you guys for joining me. Do you have any shout outs? Where can people follow you? What other content are you doing? What else do they want you to pay attention to?
I have nothing to sell you. I'm Esports Law on everything. Feel free to follow me if you found this interesting. If you did not find this interesting, definitely do not follow me, because this is essentially what my social media is like a bunch of business and legal thoughts about esports, and then like a little bit about like fantasy novels. I'm a huge Harry Potter fanatic, so if you like Harry Potter stuff, you're gonna get a lot of that too. Thank you guys both for having me. This was a fascinating discussion. Really enjoyed it. Definitely will come back if I'm asked to.
I hope we get to do it again, because there's so many issues in esports that I really do think we can profitably talk about. But yeah, Nahaz Dota on Twitter, Professor Nahaz on Instagram if you like cat pictures. Thanks for tuning in, guys.
All right, thank you everyone for joining us. As always, drop a comment, write a review, share with your friends. All of those things help other people discover this lovely podcast. We'll see you guys on the next one.
A bullshit, and then you bust by season 2 because you spent it on the tax. I got a cupboard full of this shit.
You've got a tournament organizer that has not met its obligations and continues to not and makes no plans to. Don't let them use your game again.